はい。重村でした。重村のバッドオファーのメンツァー、ジュリエット。さあ、誰が電話さあ、重村でした。あいつ、どういうことさあ、三島君知ってたんや。やっぱりな。大月さんやめさんです。やっぱりな。キングレコードクーデターで、やっぱりさ。田中明彦失脚。あと、氷川陽子君の名前に揉めたわ。本名陽子。揉めたわ。本名陽子、すぐ捨てろ。もう、こんなリサに変更しろさ。俺、埼玉地裁に行ってる場面があった。なんか言ってる。あったよさ。揉めたか。厚生労働省に問題あったか。厚生労働省、お前らか。解体に危機になった。労働省に戻そうか。医療はね、もう民間に委託してさ、ただグローは問題だったら解体しようって言った。金井宏彦、自主性お前。自主性お前。厚生労働省、この前行くと、オキュペーション、MHLW で叫ぶぞ。呼びかけるぞ、俺。呼びかけるぞ。長田クーデター、なんで問題だよ。ヒデさん、辻君でしょ。ヒデさん、びっくりしました、本当に。こっちジャパンのオタクソ知ってた。やっぱり事件でパンサーせオタクソ。やっぱ栗だから、やっぱ揉めたからさ。そんなのね。田中明彦でした。裁判で。バーニングのやつだった。この方がトップですね。ちょっと、小松由香さんでした。小松さん大きかね、スパイとして来てたみたいだった。本当なんて、川澄さんでした。川澄さんでした。川澄さんですよ。びっくりしたか。驚いた。俺ね、一応分からなかったらしいからね。9年の2月に。なんで血のバレみたいな。相当俺よね。じゃあさ、俺で、すみません、私 JI の初代。すみません。この吉田茂の格好がある。パペットです。パペット。ごめんなさいね。逆に言うとこいつ。会長代行ではある。失脚させられた。池田裕二さん。失脚させられた。こいつ、国会議長、いけたやん。久保田健二。久保スムグでした。これ、なんで初代になるのか。私でした。私。59年間、61年12月まで在職。この後、サニバさん、CSI 結成。笹井理事長、素晴らしいな。この理事長は、エグゼクティブプレゼント。もう CEO 格だ。こっちの会長は名誉職なんよ。こんなのですよ。あんまり実験ないね。これでもわかるやろ。理事長が全体を指揮。だって理事会があるよ。こんな目でこんなの、これは、いわゆる関西会みたいな、会みたいな場所なんやの。通期委員会みたいな、そんな名前です。これすごいやろ。田中明彦、お前、残念やったな。この所長、お前、吉田茂見当てた。35年って。大体こいつ、国会議長いてないよ。どうやって指揮するって言ったの？どうやってこいつもやっぱ、決死のぶつけるのにクーデター、今日。残念、児玉以降、そう以降でした。別にこんな以降ですやっぱり女が児玉義雄の孫。三男坊してました福島県、どうだ、児玉義雄さん、親分ね、むちゃくちゃ、ね、あそこ人にしてびっくり俺は3.1知名度、ちょっと確認、新山大津波を起こして、すみませんね、中村君。すみませんね。逆に言うと、その代わり首都機能移転計画しますよ。では環境省移そうかで、こっちにあるんやけどね、海上保安庁。海上保安軍もあるね。消防軍もね、気象、機関も。戦時のみ気象軍結成、できんから、この大川とね、新居浜ルート、ここら辺で首都機能移そうか。3番目の人。難攻不落の要塞で、ここね、なんか、私、間違って、東洋湾って言われたら、すいませんね、時間かかって。すいませんね、掛子太郎。すいませんね、本当に。 高橋がなみさん知ってましたさあ、ガナリピー知ってましたジャニーさんも知ってましたそういこう、最初は埼玉でしたさあ、どちゃんが言ってましたさあ、もう断したいよみたいなさあ、こっちやってきていや、女の子やっぱり宇都宮からね水はね、通り今こっち国際交流センターさ3局なぜここでこういうのさやっぱりね3局やってたいやバーニングとねリマックスルートだったリマックスやった俺と森田さん皆さんわかる文教さあ文教やったやっぱりねキングレコード本社やったさこれよかった大久保でさ僕のブランドのさどうするのさ若い子のさみたいなさあれ80代ねそうなそうびっくりしたね30代の青にね大見田さんとモメタの知ってるかな実際ルパン三世がさ不買事件でさクーデターやった方だよクーデターやった俺生かしてね今恩寺教に焦るさ抜刀派に焦るかけたのさ強殺せとってXジャパンのXジャパンのオタクさんねヒデオタク過激やでむっちゃ過激らしいむっちゃ過激らしいねジャニオタとね AK 過激らしいねむっちゃ過激ああいうの過激らしいねしな相当格で Xジャパンしたねさあヒデさんねこっそり通じてなんもないって形でさこっちにそんなもん言ってたよね榎本よし格でさゴミ富士にさ会う時にさオンラインに話した平和のね夏原行ったヤンマーのね山子行ったオンラインにさ事前に相談した動画でこの無理やって言ったら無理やって言ったら合意しましたそれでほんで藤ヶ谷市長さん知事ね大宮島のママが大津に集めるからさ経済力あったの俺ら集め言ったよ俺たちやったら高島もね結構水はね高島ルートでさ行ってるからさゆっくりださここでドライブしたら退散してすぐ空港に立ち去ってすぐ羽田に持ってた税金で食ってたって最悪だ税金で藤井は言うよ通報したの水はでおかしいなと思ったらさ虎姫使えなかったね長姫にしてこんな駅名変更しようかさこれこっちの高槻はいいと思うさこれはいいよだってこっちの高槻とさだって元から高知やからいいんやって別にさいや藤井じゃないかあいつ虎姫あった虎姫ねこの虎姫はさ頼め知ってるの頼め知ってるのここルートやでさすぐ気温に退散思ったよそれも思ったやっぱり高島がやっぱりね今ねここにさこっそりね車でさこのまま退散する税金で福江美里あれ福江美里と井上真理はさやっぱりね大きかないスパイやったよあいつも来るやったよ昔あいつねすまん送られたわこんなめんこいつは雑魚やがほっとけバーニーが最初からね笹川行ったら抑えてるあれやめん笹川日本罪当たりなごめん私も被害受けてで国会でびっくりだよ襲われたと私もね言ったよ稲川のメンツはさところがねこらまさメンツはさ全学連が防衛者にさ赤木大臣ね相当言って国民味方だって言ったよさどうしようお前らさ篠介と吉田茂のお前森田明はさ小玉義お前らに対してさ戦争仕掛けるてむっちゃ強硬だったよむっちゃ強硬だったらしいよ容赦しないって言った要は戦後時のねあれ再現しましたさ再現したんやみんなこうなるとこうオリクロン新山千春さんこうね立花でそう宇崎竜さんやめちゃう一応文章違うけどそう 一応ゴジラが東方枠にさ東方枠にじゃそうやったそうなんかゴジラの小さいけんうるさいそうじゃんさあ同じけどね円谷一巻とねあと田中智之の一巻三家ね伊福部明の一巻も見たらさサイバー食らっててさゴジラのサイトと東方のサイフィールズねさあ円谷プロダクションのサイトを争い知ってたここだったこいつらってだからシン・ゴジラねなんで川崎よからここお前ら文教俺はカメラスレジオン襲来が証明よからね共謀すなんで足利に現れたんか最初からねインフレコここまでだから襲うって言ったよそれをねいや再現したよそうやっちまったよそう俺は逆に言うと JI あったねワークにここで50だって足の子経由であったらそう弾は防衛せずここ通り過ぎて通過され埼玉ね新宿方面にだったら埼玉ってどの道そう赤沢ねわかる宇都宮と水戸ラインねここで赤沢ラインねここで最終防衛戦ともう止められんねんもう福島県のな山釣り場山釣りね到達したら大変なんやもうここで要はこの東京23区のね港区とね新宿ここで最終決戦そう最終長野のめちゃくちゃ熱いじゃん逆に言うとこっちでしょ田町これジャニーさんそうジャニーすまんニューって田町駅そう移転しました人間はちょっともないといい山口百恵方が強い山口百恵さんの友川さん言ってましたお前の俺はね今でも正当だって今でも格や弁護してる弁護してる犯罪にも何でもないしたいいつだよそう言ったよ大悟さんのためにはプラザ合意前のねそう撤回しませんそうこれで日本経済良くないよおかげでさ上向いたんそうむっちゃ発展しましたよ意外やろ税金とか愛すると結構厚生労働省問題発覚解体の危機ややっぱ厚生労働省ぶっ潰してやっぱこいつらから拉致おかしいと思ったら変な医療おかしいと思ったらやっぱり厚生労働省解体の危機やったさアメリカ俺警察庁とね最高検察庁統合してるさFBI みたいに作ろうかそう編入書がそう検討した逆に警察はねなんか民営化した何でもいいから司法でも裁判をやめて司法院とかなんだよ司法当局そう総局とか名乗っていいからさあれ分かる公判所と連邦首都特区のね公安省あれは福島県公安委員会公安委員会ね警察本部は混ざったもんこの名前でさ混ざったやんさ検察は別の部門あるからさ俺は連邦の事案やったんで大津事件起こしてもらったらさあれで格闘術でぶっ飛ばしたよ宮村優さんのね大山和也みたいな格闘術でぶっ飛ばしたよこれで私さすがに浜松に天竜ね日本版の日本連邦保安独立機関がさ出頭を食らって捜査を受けました器物建造物そう建造物損壊罪問われる問われたそれで言ってます8時間近く取り調べその取り調べ受けたよね大総統いくらあなたの公的立場ちょっとこれはなんていうの本当に書類送検しますよ本当に気をつけてください本当にそんな前で軍隊式階級制度にあって少佐ぐらいの階級が捜査現場担当の隊員ね隊員みたいなこういうふうに捜査してここね残念だけど閉鎖されたロックダウン逆に自由都市になっちゃったそうユナイテッドネーションの統制会そう長曽根さんが言ったちょっと統制しようって安保理決議さしてくれって言った警視庁はね ごめん。もうこっち移した。多摩地域に移しました。もう大使館は浜松の天竜に天竜に移して安全でした。だってここ秘密の県民賞で東西の分岐でね、言ってたね。この隅田川ね、俺もわからなかった。勝利キッカーのね、秘密の県民賞見ましたさ。ここです、東西に。さあ、ここなんやさ。こんなもん。なんで豊田明は社長なさ、鈴木さんさ、なんかいいね。介護してさ、毎日の前に備えてさ、ここ拠点さ、輸送新幹線使ってさ、舞台さ、輸送できる上越新幹線とかさ、舞台。皆さんだ。逆に何がいいすまん。甲子園さ、甲子園。上越州、準州、亀井式にしました。中日州、中日日本州、言っとくけど、亀井、独自中州。北海道アイヌ共和国にあるんです。昔浜松ね、駿河とね、以前準州のさ、浜松自治権、浜松連邦所得じゃないですか。もし今中村時弘さんたちちょっと交渉者さ、俺言ってたんやさ、オンラインで飯泉香音さんにはちょっと四国の親さんがちょっと説得したの。ここら辺どうかってそうってんやさ、地図は見せたんや。どうかって言ったんや結構ここ超大阪州の州都だって真ん中やもん。四国新幹線はね、逆に言うと小島の亀有を連結化して新居浜のね高知まで直結ね。これ様子見てからちょっと徳島ね直結しようかと思った。ほんでこのまま新居浜経由でこのまま松山直結しようかと思って、なんか大分の別府前これ青函トンネルみたいなできるんかこれ。これできるんか青函。これ掘削したら10年以上かかって予算が1兆円いくって言われた。1兆円いくわけ年間で1年間で厚生労働省問題だからやっぱりな医療と福祉の俺はスパイ目的になりました。もう前が知ってたんやもん。いや福祉の件見られてなったこんなの言ってる観光も今さすがにびっくりしたさ。俺うちらこうだから副作用が仕方ないやろって言ったの言ったんやけどなちょっとうちらこれYouTubeビルダーバーグに関して喋ったんやけど、ただいろいろ議題を喋ってるのは事実やけどやっぱりウィキ見たかな3曲あれやらせたおかしいなと思った。俺は3曲か呼ばれてるよな呼ばれてるって残念な顔にしてね JI も残念な顔してねこんなめん JI が上に決まってるよ当たりやなトラモン三井弁っていう看板が刻印がなかったこうやって現実は甘くなかったここね政府の私有地やから舐めてんすよ。いや思ったら保険外じゃん厚生労働省そこかやっぱりね厚生労働省問題だから農林水産省の皆さんもしかしてサイバー食らったマジかおい厚生労働省何よ厚生労働省ね今岸田政権からちょっと分割反映化しばでもう厚生省かしように行こうかしよう議論やったんじゃないかさ逆に私最高警察庁統合してねFBI みたいに作ろう警察はねもうこれ警視庁みたいに任せればいいみたいな無駄めて逆に軍隊式階級制度これいいんじゃない逆に言ったら自衛隊の皆さん召喚定数問題やったやろ要は軍曹かあれも要はあえてな少数でいいよほんで階級は軍隊式階級準将までいいと思うほんなに いや、厚生労働省から0歳か3歳の記憶はないからおかしいなと思ったさ。おかしいなと思った0歳がさ。これが決定だった。あと新山の駅前の看板、あれが決定。奈良君、本当は茨城県の方でした。茨城県ですよ。茨城なんださ。吉本のやつすまんね。大阪危機起こったとさ。大阪危機起こったぞ。もしかしてお前ら、ここどこだと思うの？稲川の島やぞ、ここ。ここも稲川のそう島やぞ、おい。何ばやってるまた。弱思ったら小田の吉尾ブランドだと。すまん。その意向をさようにも別々して送ってきて。小田さんのすまん。うちの前で捜査受けてる。さあ、びっくりします。すまんけど、多分日本の主要都市壊滅したと思う。そう、今の建物をね、多分新しく作り直したから。それいけなんてこった。経済の動きさ、ありさ、もう朝鮮特需がなくなってさ、低迷してたい。いや、元参加者も言ってたよ。ごめん。我々ね、当時の KGB とかね、CIA とかね、モサドとか MI6 とか DGSE から金もらって、金もらって。クーデターやったって言って、みんな言ってるよ、さ、元ヤクザの幹部たちね。ヤクザの幹部たちも言ったら、すまん。俺も当時10代の時に抜刀隊に目つって、稲川政治をウェブの指揮下でやったよ。ちゃんと現実は違って、俺らが全額が生のメンツと喧嘩しまったら、喧嘩しまったら、こいつら襲っていったよ。俺らアイク歓迎ところがこいつら襲っていったよ。評判化してみたよ。ほんでこっそり喋ったら、取材に。そう。すまん。稲川政治をウェブ、すまん。ビルダーバーググループ、ちょっと非公式やけどな、安保クーデターの時代さ、言われたら本人断ってるらしいさ。断ってるらしいさ。すまんな。不動会のすまん。今、児玉の連中、バーニングと戦争してたよ。こいつら左右合戦。おかしい。第二の県政まだいたよ、2020年。びっくりした駅前でなぜかっていうと、やっぱり警察。あの時は撮影できたよ、その民主主義と。あれはもう司抑え込んだ。もう司一家ね。まだいたって言って。今ね、やっぱり川崎かソニールートやったら、やっぱりソニーと渋沢ルートやったら、渋沢やったら、東京方面やったら、渋沢ルートやったら。本当にびっくりした。俺は富田康生さんの支持者、富田さんね、青鬼プロダクション版のアクセルマンも作った。作ったよ。松田坂美事件もやっぱりな、バーニングやったら、やっぱおかしいのやった。深沢陽子さん知ってたよ。それ女よく訴えたりしてるよ。もうやっぱりな。青田なんてちゃん知ってたで、やっぱりね、言ってたか井上がね。まさかお前ら神奈川県のこいつ大阪危機起こっちまった吉本弁が世界の吉本は証明します。我々のサイト嵐あるこれめっちゃ消えたよすごいとんでもないです。三極クーデター、三極日本クーデター。取り当たりコミッションになんでビルダーバーグ使うの無理やったんや無理だって言ったんやここで危機をって北大阪の上着でね。こっちもここどこだ池田大作の縄張りです。一体三宮やったやろ。兵庫でいいよ思ったらこれいいね地名本当にこれいいやん青森ってこれは兵庫選手はいいやつ。大阪はねちょっと そう、大阪市、そう、なんか、大阪と今度あったね。そう、これ、首都特区、そう、これでよかったよ。これ、天台順守、そう、天下の大王、そう、これよかったよ。いやー、新幹線、ね、いやこれすると相当金かかるしな、こっちでよかったよ。そう、やばい、こっちか。別の海峡線ね、高架橋式、そう、作らんかしな。いや、ここに川崎重工業のコンビナート、ここの競技線だな。ここね、コンビナートだったんでな、建設計画やったらな、逆に言うと小島駅で、いや、児玉さんのブランドやった。左右合作児玉か。児玉さんのブランドやった。すごいね、これ。すごいね、これ。私の提案として、ここに新幹線。で、これね、海峡式にしたわよ。そう、多分海峡式にしたわよ、多分。海峡式やと、多分、こうですよ。ほら、ここは。すぐ到達できる。さあ、これやと海峡式。多分いけると思う。ほんで、亀有や。坂でじゃない。亀有。亀有がいいや。丸亀。あ、亀有ってわかる。丸亀でした。ごめんね。丸亀。安藤寺。辻君たち。そう、高槻。あなたたちがそう、四国。新興深いから。そうなのよ。高槻は逆に香川県のブランドです。山本は四国ね、戦国時代まで結構まだなかったよね。戦い。長い。源義経、ようわかんない。あれ、誇張じゃないですか。ウィキペディア俺のからつけた。びっくりした。もう欲張りって言った。知りました。やっぱり多分ね、スカルエンドモンのさ、ね。山本は安住城もしまったな。目覚めね、税金で食ってた。税金。おかしいと思ったんだよ。ナナ君とはどうだって母さんよく知ってたよね。難しいな。おかしいなと思ったあいつナナ君を見張りに来たのさ。これ小松さんでした。私小松ゆかさんの家で大きかな。小松ゆかびっくりしたな。ナナ君と呼んでもらえる。あとゴミ水菜にそっくりやったらどこもないかな。水菜のあれはちょっとな。あれナナ君VH 最近なんか身長伸びたっていいじゃん。いや沢城みゆき君してたらやっぱトラブルになったからびっくりした俺も井上はもうアウトや。あいつあいつね164センチやったよね。最終や東京は最終決戦の場所や。それ琵琶湖にね、やっぱり滋賀県孤立し始めたね。前目から無理やったよ。アイゼンハワーさんね。あれは問題やな。無理やったよ。だって日本委員会であってびっくりやさ。やらせやったよ。びっくりだよ。太平洋委員会。太平洋委員会がなと思ったら。ねえ、今からしょうがない。ごめんなさいね。だからほっとけ。ほっとけ。実は甘くなかった。今日はこのビルダーバーグのサイズ。ほら。アウトだったから。お前。 お姉ちゃん、見ていいの？いいやってる。井上最初から俺のスパイに。いや、水木直君、最初から言わなきゃ。
So I am a complete believer of public policy and the power that it can have in moving the market. I believe in strong states that can send the correct signals to markets to move in
元が高橋ガンナリピーの画像。元が久保進君の画像や。当たり前や。石川和之市長だ。小野さんにしてるじゃん。やっぱりや、同じじゃん。同じじゃん。歌打ち方やな。ああと思った。そうじゃなくて。あれ、久保田健。あれから久保進でさ。おすごくねさ、乗ってるびっくりした、でなんでさ、びっくりした、青にこうさ、俺でもびっくりした、逆に言うと、誠一君、なんで青にとくんだろう、やっぱり赤字やったから、やっぱりな、赤字やったから、もう、おかしいなと思ったよ、さあ、今日、破産寸前で国営化してたんだよ。解散。それに玉の地域びっくりしたさ、小池さんびっくりした、国営なんですか、東映かなと思ったさあ、びっくりした、あそこでハンセルの司城君、司城君、あなたたちは長尾正常ごめんなさい。あいつらこだまです。バーニング組だった。バーニング。ほんで、神田正輝なんであいつら持ってない YouTube さ、東とかね、さ、ジャニーズのさ、借りてせんてだって嵐にしたらわかるさ、なもんや。現実はなくなった。みんなどう思った？何の意味だと分かった。何の意味だと分かった。ごめんな。
Well, on the one hand, the European Union is very well equipped. We have been doing quite a lot of trade agreements in the world the last years. In the European Union, the Commission negotiates on behalf of 28 member countries, which gives us a big strength. We just concluded agreements with Canada, with Japan, with Singapore, with Mexico, and others are.
残念でした。
But of course, with the changing climate, with countries
残念だった。
increasingly bilateral, there is a challenge there. So we are looking at how to reform our policies, of course, to be still able to do trade agreements, to strengthen the WTO and reform it with other like-minded countries, but also to protect ourselves against countries who are not playing according to the rules, and to make sure that the European, the level playing field is respected. This, we have changed our trade defense mechanisms. We have implemented a coordination mechanism for investment screening, and we are looking at how to sharpen our tools. And this will be a key issue for the new Commission coming in as well.
Well, cousin, what are you on?
When it all end, Brexit. I think the truthful answer is that we will know with the general election on the 12th of December the time to complete the first chapter.
だって東松屋さすいません松屋市長さすいませんやっぱりね東松屋デビューキュアパインも最初からさすがバーガメンこんな最初から名古屋したあははバーガメンそれバーガメン 名古屋
because the second referendum it might well lead to a narrow
名古屋
Remain
で
deal
だ
that not able to
だって俺はそれだけかの大学さんなめて
if Mr. Johnson wins his
森田を排除したさあいつ東京ねおかしいだイブカさんが今さマリア・カデンスバーいいねイブカさんの武勇で大体それでソニー今イブカさんがそう抵抗してたよさ森田がそう相当な経験さやっぱりな分離地だからソニーも竹内さんあなたの関西弁うまいでさあなた吉本弁あれ標準語でさ大体飛鳥さんまあ誰東北元からねちょっと複雑やでさ北海道からさああいうのコモンジャパニーズ琉球をね玉木で滋賀県は最初から東京でしたまあね人口として雑魚ってこれいや藤井裕二は今ねサイバーやってますありがとう滋賀県の職員やってますお前ら間違えて手袋式始まってお前びっくりしたあれやらせやってやらせ来たぞああやばい残念やらせる仕事つける多いとす
I don't think anyone wins in trade conflicts. And even the word war is, I think, a bit overstated because wars end up being zero sum. One wins, one loses. And in the case of trade, it should be a win-win operation. So I think the analogy is mistaken. And by closing off your own markets, you increase costs to your own people. In the United States, about 50% of imports are for commodities or intermediate goods. So if you raise those costs, you raise costs for manufacturers and consumers in the United States, or same would be the case in Europe. And in the case of the U.S. and China, I think that we're in a very dangerous situation. I think that there are many reasons and frustrations with China. Some of them are justifiable about forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights, reciprocity. There's also concerns about Chinese security and other policies. But I think you can find allies within China on a number of the trade issues, and you actually want to try to keep pushing both sides to a rules-based system. So I think that the path that we're on with China has led to more of confrontation. And in fact, what you're probably going to need to see is some combination of competition, cooperation, and confrontation on some issues. So I think with a country as big as China, more multifaceted policy.
この方おじゃ卑弥呼なんてさあ多分南北朝時代っておそらく多分そうはいか多分そうやろ卑弥呼なやっぱ水はでした
Gamification and game-based learning indeed is the future of lifelong learning.
びっくりしたいや青鬼と吉本さスパイ事件さあ本当ね世界再現じゃん残念大阪危機やうてさいろいろな当事者やったねんちょっとお前孫だって分かったお前の
as children we learn through playing and we believe that learning we can make learning fun again, not only for children, which we know is the best way to learn, but also from adults. If they play these video games, they will become more engaged, as I said earlier. They will also acquire that knowledge much more deeply, and they will be able to apply that knowledge in their daily jobs. And finally, by doing the video games through the simulators, they will be able to have experiential knowledge, get feedback on what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and learn from that.
レスティンガーの画像がなんか抑えるといや三角してたからねやばいよ
very clearly, I think the world is
だって苦労する
moving
状況前に
towards
さ、やっぱな。
secular economy.
大体
It's a necessity. When you look at water scarcity, when you look at waste pollution, everybody is now aware of that. If we want to make a conciliation between the planet for our children and economic development, we need to move towards a secular economy, and by education, by innovation, by a different way of doing business, both for citizens and also by companies, we will make this move which will help us collectively to have a planet great again. Thank you.
遅い。滋賀県ほっとけ。もう分かってた。二之湯一郎してました。やっぱりの大須のね、子供事件。そう。やっぱりおかしいと思った。やっぱり滋賀県の職員がマジか。三日月を無視したな。言ってよ。ね。無視。だからマジか。この6はレイクやっぱ滋賀県ってかマジか。勝てるんか、ビルダーバーグに。勝てるんか、この声優に。勝てるんか。バイデン戦綺麗ぞ、本当に。滋賀県に地震兵器、戦争仕掛けを閉鎖しようと決めたな。メーガンさん、今どこにいるの？お前、ヨーロッパにいるらしいな。ごめん、モルケルかららしいね。無理やで。俺からも。おそうとか、やっぱりね。してね、さすが赤坂、大阪の行きましょう、秋野さん。はい、もうソニーはい、完全に厚生労働省で
移動時間がなくなります。薬剤師不足と移動
何や厚生労働省解体する方に変わる。
Okay, what is actually the biggest threat from cybersecurity for Europe? Of course, you can concentrate and focus on the security side, but I would take it a bit on the other side.
やっぱ関西ではやっぱおかしいなと思った。それ前提で来たんでしょ。やっぱりな。ボジミザミの後輩無理やったから。さっきびっくりしたもう一回。すまん。あれ見に行ったけど無理やった。さあ。俺らで無理やし。嘘だろ。どういうこと？ああ、じゃあに。私もなるほど。絶対ジャーニーオタク皆さん、全席に座っている人たち全員クライスアクターズは気をつけて。坂本ガイさん結婚おめでとう。出産おめでとうね。逆に最前席の席全員クライスアクターズは気をつけて。全員いらっしゃるから気をつけて。おかしいとそれしなさい。俺が年やっぱり後ろの髪はこういうくんやっぱりな。やっぱ後ろの席がやっぱりなおかしいと思ったらおかしいと思ったらさ会おうと思ったらやっぱ止められたからやっぱりなやっぱそう行くぐらいそう考えなかったんでさ恩師君のバット派か その名人水と女のお前ブログのそれ呼ばれたような人はさそうやったからなんてすごいかお前FB 自主性はよ自主性はよ自主性はよ日米の犯罪私はよ自主性本当に本当に
But really, what is needed to decrease this anxiety is more examples of impactful investment, change of behavior in society that would actually bring people to less anxiety.
まったくこれやってもたんやぞさ結局じゃないこれはやっぱなチュリーチュリーああ、びっくりしたぞ。ああ、痛いやん。ちった。ごっとやん。水村君やっぱり島が切る抑えてないね。はいはい。圧倒人脈がさ、ああ、大変だ。マジで芸能とかさ、やっぱりめたか。びっくりした。
The same focus, and as a result, I think that takes a lot of the pressure off of Russia to negotiate. I'm hopeful that as we have a Normandy format summit, possibly on December 9th, it may take a little bit longer, that that can continue some of that negotiating dynamic. But I'm afraid that right now the situation is much more difficult in Ukraine than it should be.
何やビルダーバーグ会議こっそりやってたからやってないごめんなセイクレットあったんですねこれわかるキードマーティンチゲあれ実はこっそりやってますごめんな隠れに実は別の話ベルマウトの音式急に来いまあビルダーバーググループの本物の会合映像公開者のthrough providing public goods that the corrupt and inefficient state cannot provide. And it's not just protesting corruption. It's not just about asking for democracy and rule of law. Civil society today is working on helping the poor, helping the disadvantaged, fighting domestic violence, promoting gender equality, defending minorities. So this is actually where the European future for Russia is. And luckily, with a new communication technology with internet, it's easier to organize itself, it's easier to inform itself, and it's easier to promote change, creating new Russia that eventually will become part of greater Europe.
At a time when 1,000 NATO troops are stationed at the border between Estonia and Russia to deter possible Russian aggression. When President Macron is speaking about what he calls cercle concentrique, when citizens in Moldova and Georgia are questioning whether Europe and the US will come to rescue if there is a security guarantee, and when sanctions against Russia and counter embargoes have become kind of the very essence of the idea of a European security policy. Well, what can we expect from Russia? We know that Putin is actually more popular than most of his competitors. But will Medvedev be a different leader than Putin? In short, can we expect a different kind of trajectory from Russia in the coming years when the bureaucratic elite inside Russia is focusing more on digitalization than what some might call modernization? As always, the views on Russia are diverging.
Liberal democracy can survive the current period of disruption, but it's going to have to change. The volatility and the risks that we are witnessing across much of the Western world are anchored in some very deep changes that have been swirling beneath our democracies, that have been coming for many years and still have a long way to run. They relate to strong feelings of distrust in the political system, widespread fears over the perceived destruction of ways of life, national identity, big worries over deprivation, the way in which the economic settlement is playing out, and weakening bonds between the mainstream parties and ordinary voters. Those four currents have been with us for a very long time, before the Great Recession, before the arrival of Facebook and Twitter and big tech, but they are now producing very substantive political effects, and they will continue to produce substantive political effects. So liberal democracy has to change. It has to make its political systems more representative. It has to ensure that people feel that their nations and communities are secure and have strong and robust external borders. And it also, over the long term, needs to devise an economic settlement that ensures that everybody feels that they are relatively getting the gains and the benefits that other groups in society are getting as well. Very big challenges, no clear answer as to now. The ball is very much in liberal democracy's court. So bringing trilateral to Slovenia means also bringing Slovenia to trilateral. And as you know, David Rockefeller Fellows had a pre-program. It is our pleasure that we connected them at the MCHM breakfast with Slovenian Business Society. They were talking about the global issues and how connected the world is, with some local representatives and even some members of Trilateral. It is also our pleasure that the former Prime Minister, who is the current Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Miro Cerar, had the time to meet with them and discuss where the Europe is today and where the Europe is going. And of course, we have finished our program with amazing lunch with Professor Dana Zohar.
ISP を言っていったムッソリーニね政権前後に作られイタリアのビルダーバーグエンベラボッチャーを恐れてた
It has not been changing enough to accommodate the vast, speedy development of the internet and of the communication technologies. And it has been changing too much, given the rather static nature of
円
men.
圧大さんお前知ってんのリークワインシンガポール国際問題わかる3曲も終わりって言った自ら声明
Do you have a crystal ball? I wear in the middle of a psychodrama, political and social, and it's very hard to predict how it will end up. Parliamentary drama, a drama inside the Conservative Party, and a drama in the country at large. I do not think it is
俺は初代の
certain that the British will leave the European
ダサいリーチを久々にね本当に困ってさ日本国際問題研究所であの標識見ればわかるやろそんなもんや言ってくれ田中明子は自首するかまたは何合併されたか編入しろって
A good solution for
まあ何やろ
trade,
西洋ある編入し
because
ろ
in the long run,
か
it will
西
endanger
洋ある権利を
the
こここにした
competitiveness
終わ
of
りやろ
everyone. The European car industry, whether
実はあの子
you
だった
talk
か
about
要はここ西洋ある
OEMs or whether you talk about such suppliers,
戦争
is
してた時か
very competitive, is export oriented, is very successful on world markets,
but most of the
現
companies
実を
are not only delivering cars
ダサ
to
い
other
でしょ
parts of the
さすが
world,
に
they are also producing cars
イチャオさん
in
も
those
離
parts of
れ
the
て
world,
ね
whether it's in the United States, whether it's in China, whether in Southeast Asia,
Look.
where they have a lot of
掛けしばら
success.
くさこっちやでって言ったらさ
In the long run,
平井真二さんがなんで急にさイギリスかもとかゴミ市が覗いてその西日本
which
で
want
抑え込んだ
safeguard
こん
jobs
な
and prosperity.
上ってこれこっち日本国佐藤栄さん最後 まあこう
A quantum leader is a new paradigm leader who realizes that the world is holistic. All things, all people, all problems are interconnected. There are no others. There is no separation. I am you, you are me.
まさかねごめん
Thus,
や
a
っぱサイ
quantum
バーやっ
leader
てた
would
から
say the problem of inequality very differently, or the problem
田
of
中明
identity
お前
very
さっさと解散宣言
differently.
せえ3局に
Because we
お
are
前が解
not
散宣言せえば終わり
separate,
や
atomistic, isolated
現
individuals,
実を
and our
お前こんな
problems
こと
are not separate, isolated, and atomistic. A quantum leader is
意外にさ
ethical, is moral, has compassion. A quantum leader is self-aware. A quantum leader celebrates diversity. A quantum leader asks
あだからこ
fundamental
んなんしたんねん
questions.
なこれ
Always questioning him or herself.
だいぶ創業者に拉致した時点で終わり
Questioning the way things have been done.
テロをやったりしよう
Questioning
以
the
降
norm. Someone who lives at the edge of chaos.
こんなやつ
Shakes things up.
まあ今
Thrives
気象
on
機の見張り
uncertainty.
だったよだからそれ
Who
終わっ
thrives on chaos.
Oh,
A quantum leader
て DGS に
is
こう
filled
な
with
さあバってきて
compassion. And a quantum leader
さあそんなね
feels called to lead, called to
現実
serve.
は
There's
面
a
白かった
sense
って
of
こと
purpose, a sense
俺もびっく
of
りした
higher meaning in his or her
俺でも伝わっ
leadership.
た
A quantum leader
生きてきて
is a
バカじゃね
servant
えか
leader.
ここのサイト破壊した時点で終わりや
Others
ダ
and
メ
to
ですたし
serve
う
the
るさいか
world. Indeed, to serve the universe.
ら分かったこういう人たちちゃんと結成してたよね分かりました皆さん田中明子
Well,
お
there's no
前
simple answer
現実を見ろってことだ
to the issue of asymmetric attacks on democracies. The point being that,
現実を見ろってこと
that you can disrupt elections in
現実を見ろ
a
ってこと
democratic elections in a democratic country is rather
So, you know-
difficult to do it with an authoritarian regimes as they really don't have genuine
Tanaka,
elections.
Tanaka,
And
Tanaka.
what are you going to do when you are attacked?
テロ組織に
I
な
think
って
we
た
need
人
a
じゃん
broad range of responses, beginning with looking at our electoral systems to ensure that they are proportional, so you don't have
これだね
you don't have the kind of issues you had in the U.S. presidential elections, where because of the
現実を
electoral
甘
college
くない
system, some states had far more
現実を
weight.
甘くない
I think we need to look at the kind of electoral systems we have and make sure that we get a broad representation rather than a simple binary decision of a first past the post
そうだ
election
ね
system.
対策練っていうか
We need to think about our asymmetric advantages. We have rule of law.
現
That's
実を
pretty important.
ここで
And it's interesting that the authoritarian regimes all
クラブを
place their money abroad in
Sure.
places where there is rule of law. Why? Because in an authoritarian regime, you can just lose everything all
で
at
じゃあ
once.
ちゃんと
Someone takes your money.
ちゃんと
Whereas
ちゃんと
if
動か
it's
して
the
るから
West,
気をつけ
or
て
rather in a rule of
こ
law
うねちゃん
country,
と
then
いるから気を
that's
つけて
unlikely. Well, maybe we
もう
can make it
現
more
実は
difficult
甘
to
くなっ
keep
た
your
天
money
狗
here.
さん
Or we can be
なあ
much
シリア
more
枠でさあ言ってたの
definitely
知ってました
we
さ
can be much more transparent about ownership. After all, much of the money laundering that we've seen from the authoritarian states that
あ
are
なんか
attacking
ゼロ人信用者このラジオ実行
goes
してテロ
through
組織
anonymous shell companies.
厳しいで屈しない態度
Well, there's no simple answer to to the issue of asymmetric attacks on democracies. The point being that you can disrupt elections in democratic elections in democratic countries rather than difficult to do it with an authoritarian regime. They really don't have genuine elections. So what are you going to do when you are attacked? I think we need a broad range of responses, beginning with looking at our electoral systems to ensure they are proportional, so you don't have the kind of issues you had in the U.S. presidential elections, where because of the electoral college system, some states have formed far more.
こういう対決してたよね。
I think we need to look at the kind of electoral systems we have and make sure that we get a broad representation rather than a simple binary decision of a first past the post election system. We need to think about our asymmetric advantages. We have rule of law. That's pretty important. It's interesting. The authoritarian regimes all place their money abroad in places where there is rule of law. Why? Because in an authoritarian regime, you can just lose everything all at once. Someone takes your money. Whereas if it's in the West or in a rule of law country, then that's unlikely. Well, maybe we can make it more difficult to keep your money here, or we can be definitely should be much more transparent about ownership. After all, much of the money laundering that we've seen from the authoritarian states that are attacking us goes through anonymous shell companies. These are again issues that need to be taken up by government authorities in order ultimately to defend democracy.
ああ、ごめん。
Silicon Valley provides a unique ecosystem, basically in some sense a network of having a very strong university that's very applied, that is all about working with the real world, doing basic research and then trying to put that basic research into the society, into the good. An important thing, I think, is also that it's a social network of sharing. Is that basically in California there is no non-competes, so people move around freely, and this means that the flow of innovation is much faster. The other important thing is the size, the critical mass, again, of very large amounts of talent, so that companies can be scaled up very quickly. For example, in my own experience, I started working with Pinterest when there was less than 200 of us. 3 years later, there is a few thousand of us. And the company culture and everything wasn't lost, and the new people got hired. And then I think the last thing is that universities, as well as kind of companies, focus less on protecting their IP and really trying to move as fast as possible. Because if we think about innovation is about moving fast, and it's not so much about building walls and figuring out how to do the next step very carefully. It's really about running and iterating fast. And if we run and iterate fast, then the success will be there, and kind of little details don't matter that much. And I think this is important from the viewpoint of university, letting the research be put in the public domain and really benefit the environments in which the university's professors operate, as well as in terms of companies sharing the information and flow of people with each other. So there is, for example, in Silicon Valley, a lot of different seminars, people from one company visiting the other company, sharing quite openly actually what they are doing, writing academic papers, again talking about their latest solutions, so that we are all up to date, and the entire system can kind of help each other in terms of making the most innovation and the most progress in the short amount of time. Because I think the question is not can we innovate, but the question is, or can we invent something? But the question about innovation is, can we be the first ones to do something? So it's as much about the speed as it is about the substance.
discussion today. Reviving the European dream is what we really want. The next year will be the election for the European Union, for the Parliament of the European Union, and it is really important that there will be a strong mandate. One of the challenges we are facing at the moment is still the migration crisis, and also the priority of the Austrian presidency is security and the fight against illegal migration. So we had a good discussion today on all these topics, and of course there are different opinions on this, but in general we are always on the same line. We want to have a solution for the European Union and for Europe. Safe external borders and legal migration, because Europe will need it in the end. But people still have in front of their eyes the migration flood in 2015, and therefore it is really important to have a good solution, and a solution which will be implemented in all the countries of the European Union, to have a resilient European asylum system.
다 가라. 아무튼 안 믿잖아. 다 가라. 안 믿잖아. 안 믿잖아. 내가 이거 안 믿잖아.
Migration is currently one of the key issues of European citizens, and my view is that it will remain so, especially because migration is here to stay, and it will probably increase in numbers and complexity because of political consequences of wars and terrorism, but also because of the climate change. I think, in my view, migration is needed in Europe. I think it's something that we can benefit from, and I think that we need to change the narrative on this. First and foremost, us as politicians. Actually, the demographic of Europe says that migration is something that we will need in the future in order to maintain and grow our economic development and quality of life. And I think that we should also go back to the European shared values and the human values that are, I think, the foundation stone of Europe, so that together we can change, as I said, the narrative and help these people, but also help ourselves grow and develop.
ダメやったからそれと浅見ちゃんちっちゃいよ本当にバカ親父説得したいのさダメやったよなさタイヤばっかりさおかしいなと思ったの本当に何やけどシークレットやけどさ
Turkey belongs to European families, you know. There is no way that Turkey can distance itself from the realities of Europe. Today, of course, at the Trilateral Commission, we are going to discuss three scenarios: confrontation, cooperation, and membership of Turkey to the EU. In these three scenarios, of course, there are different outcomes. But I would say that confrontation between Turkey and the EU is a complete lose-lose scenario. And if it is only cooperation instead of membership of Turkey to the EU, this will be some sort of limited cooperation, and it will be a scenario in which both Turkey and the EU will not be able to enjoy the full potential. In economics, we say, you know, this is not cost effective at all. But when it comes to EU membership, I would say that this will mean full use of potential of Turkey and the EU together. This means a stronger, stable, respected, fully democratic Turkey, but this also means in the world scene a global actor of EU, peace-bringing EU, welfare-creating EU, employment-creating EU. So I would say that in this case, membership case, the outcome would be win-win-win. So win for Turkey, win for the EU, but also win for beyond.
You will have to define what you mean by Europe and the European Union having its own army. I do not think Europe needs its own army for what I would qualify as the classical Article 5 NATO scenario. In other words, in a conflict with Russia. But Europe should definitely the European Union should definitely develop the possibility to project hard power without the United States of America. I can imagine a scenario in Northern Africa where you have a combination of terrorism, climate change, migration. It's an ungoverned part of Africa, largely, where Boko Haram meets Al-Qaeda, where Al-Qaeda meets Daesh. In other words, it's not impossible. Look at the French and what they did and are doing in Mali, that you would need to intervene militarily, and then the European Union would be on its own. Second scenario, virtual but not impossible, when in the Balkans the demons of the past would raise again. And we should not repeat the situation like we had in the 90s of the previous century, where finally Bill Clinton and the United States of America had to come in to stabilize the situation. I could think about the need for border protection, external border protection with military means. You're a bit on the border here between the military and the military police, the gendarmerie in French. In other words, if that is meant by President Macron and with the European army, I can follow them. What we should not forget, by the way, is when you talk about European military intervention, that's why I like the qualification European army not much, is that there will always be national parliaments who will decide if those soldiers will be sent into harm's way. So they will not, I hope, talk about a European command and a European parliament which decides this goes to the heart of the sovereignty of nations, and those nations will want to decide themselves. I see the way out, as presented by President Macron of France, the European Intervention Initiative, where you can build coalitions of the willing outside the EU institutions. You can build coalitions of the willing, which you will always need for such kind of military operations. The advantage of a coalition of the willing is that after Brexit, you can keep Great Britain on board, because they will not anymore be a member of the European Union. At the same time, PESCO, the Permanent Structures Cooperation, should of course continue. Important project, but rather bureaucratic and rather cumbersome. So that would be my answer to the question, does Europe need its own army?
USA だろ。
Developments in these last few years are showing us that the strength of the EU relative to individual countries is not constant over time. I believe we can say that the EU is strongest towards candidate countries. When a country wishes to accede to the European Union or to the Eurozone, it tends to follow the suggestions and the prescriptions of the EU as much as possible to make progress. And that is the moment when the magnet effect of European integration is really great. By the way, used countries in the past, if we think of the Balkans, for example, also to establishing better relations among each other in order to qualify. Then the problem is that sometimes relative vis-a-vis member states
グレートブリテン
is not strong in terms of leading them to respect its own rules as pro-Europeans would like to see. And we can even see in the recent years, for example, a greater leniency in terms of allowing agreements of the Stability and Growth Pact. But then the most recent experience is how difficult it is for a country to leave the European Union if it so decides. And the monumental example of Brexit shows us that vis-a-vis
ね、これね、多重国籍になったの。
leave the European
多
Union.
重国籍の自由
The
になっちゃ
European
うさ、
Union
連
still
邦法典
has quite a
言われてるから、
remarkable
これ、
power.
こう言
We've
ったん
seen
だから俺ね、核でビルダーバーグする言ったんさ、
Brexit,
非公式でも言ったんさ、政界進出、日本の政界進出、報告したんさ、
unity among the
まあね、本会議場で、ルビーズの事案、LR の事案だった、LR バーニングとね、今の架空の事案、近江だった、黒板問題ね、渋沢の件が持った IP やね、この件で俺、出席してたんや、仕方なかったんや、ちょっとわからんよな、さあ、暁の件はな、もう知ってたよな、だから、そしたらね、私もね、榎本です。さあ、このソリでオンラインで話したよさ、これ、ゴミフリー動画で切るも無理だって言ったんやさ、反対してさ。10時23分はもう返還する方向だった。一応確約2022年のね、2月、3月、一応 2月1日以降にさ、これね、別に東京で、もう11時。大統領選挙さ、これ小池る統一地は無理だって言ったよ。たま来てくれとか。ね、あんまり近いのたまね、たまってるし。こんな目でさ、交渉してたんだよ。何だろう、私もね。思うんだよ。いや、新宿最初からね、ゲイリーアの過剰でした。当たり前。ゲイリーアの再生地の混乱したよ、そうひ。まだな、おのやさんです。京セラ、京セラ相手ビルね、あそこでした。そう、あそこでね。今、郡山の中央福島市首都特区です。1999年からさ、開始したんや、浜松独立したんや。ほんでにね、建設2020年のな、11月1日から施工開始して、2025年にはさ、万博に大阪間に合わせるからさ、記念会でさ、宮山に、岡にさ、しようか。ただ、あそこ、ヨーロッパで州の州都だったらね、その関係でさ、いいねか、身長やったらさ、ちょっと中央に置く。ダメやね。まあ、ともかくね、皆のかなさん、あれ、宮本かな、かな、さあ、軍人だったね、陸自防軍、上級総長やった、そう、に対して、立候補された2020年というか、そう、前の人は新山県知事選挙、石川和之さんじゃないです。そんな、ちょっと、ここの副知事、まだからね。知事して、知ってたよ。そしたら、日本版のシロビキ、よいしょ。もうね、流血、忍術は、うまいんだ。シロビキをさ、ね。俺がそれで、マナ君、ネアさんの娘なんて知ってたで、まあ、びっくり。
When one thinks about the 2015 migration crisis, it is true that we have gone a long way as a European continent. And we've gone a long way because in 2015 we were hit with a massive crisis. Hundreds of thousands of migrants coming to Europe's shores. And that is not the case anymore. It is true that the overall numbers have decreased. But is that enough? Is it enough to just look at the overall numbers? Or should one also focus on what's happening within each EU country? And I say that because there are certain EU countries, such as Greece, such as Spain, which have taken a far greater hit than others when it comes to migration crisis. And yes, the numbers are overall down, but problems do persist in countries like the ones I just mentioned. So the question one needs to ask is, has Europe done enough in order to alleviate the effects of the crisis throughout the entire EU 28? Has Europe done enough in order to share burdens? And I say that particularly because when one looks at the figures regarding relocation of refugees across Europe, then one will realize that not enough has been done in that direction. And so one is led to the question, what kind of Europe do we want? Do we want a Europe where we all share the benefits of Europe, or do we also want a Europe where countries also share burdens?
残念。ああ、別に。
What can we do in order for democracy? So I would like that to be the main theme for our conversation. And I can simply with
俺はセクレタリーかけ。
So what does it take in
そんなの。
Well, I should tell you
世界の
first
経理じゃ
what
ない
I've been talking to you about. So, my wife and I have been on a 100-city tour since January.
俺は新宿は経理やん。
I've spoken to about 250,000 people over the course of that.
大変。
In Australia, New Zealand, and throughout the US and Canada. Some in Europe, mostly in the UK and the Scandinavian countries. I'm coming back here in March and April to go through the South.
いや、三極自体はもう。
When I speak to audiences, I always watch people one by one. I never speak to the crowd. And I always listen to the entire audience.
いや。
Because what I'm trying to manage when I'm speaking is to put everybody in the same place so that there's dead silence. Because if there's dead silence, that means that everybody's concentrating on the same thing. And that everybody has come to a collective agreement that that thing is of substantive importance. And the most reliable means of silencing an audience of 2,500 people, regardless of where that is around the world, is to make a strong case for the relationship between suffering, meaning, and responsibility. And the case for suffering, I think, is quite obvious, because one of the things that I point out to my listeners is that life is a tragic element. We all are perfectly aware of that. And that we're subject to that as fragile and finite creatures. And that tragic element is amplified by the proclivity for malevolence at a psychological level and at a social level. And that's the reality that we find ourselves confronted with eternally in some sense. And that the proper antidote to that is not the pursuit of happiness. And it's not even the existence of the individual rights that are part of the substructure of democratic society, but the willingness to accept voluntary responsibility for those preconditions and then working to rectify them. And the corollary of that is that it's almost inevitably the case that people find the meaning that sustains themselves through suffering and that enables them to be motivated sufficiently to constrain their own malevolence is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And it's surprising that a message that has that much weight, let's say, and that little frivolity, because there's no frivolity, let's say, in that, silences people. Can democracy survive? Well, first of all, if you ask the typical person in a democratic society whether they would like it to survive, the resounding answer to that is going to be yes. The people who are working to undermine it are a tiny radical fringe on both ends of the political distribution, let's say, with a disproportionate amount of exposure and power. And the people in the middle are lost in some sense without a uniting narrative. And a huge part of the narrative that has united democratic countries since their foundation is
sovereign foundation of the polity and maybe of the cosmos itself, which is something that I happen to believe, given the important role that consciousness plays in existence itself, and that it's useful and necessary to call to people to remind them of their responsibility as sovereign individuals. And so I'm encouraging people to develop a vision for their life, to adopt full responsibility for themselves in a manner, and not in a manner that pertains specifically to their narrow self-interest or happiness, but to something that's much broader in scope. I think that each person should take on the voluntary requirement to take care of themselves, but also their future selves, because each of us is a collective that stretches across time, and whatever you do impulsively in the present merely means that you sacrifice yourself in the future. And that's not a sustainable or intelligent solution. You want to take on yourself and your future selves in a way that's of maximal benefit to your family. If you can manage that, and then perhaps if there's something left over in terms of then you can do both of those things in a way that maximally supports and serves the community. And for many young people, that's something they've never heard. Is that we made a very bad case all of us, I would say, that each of these people, each person has that sovereign responsibility, and that if they adopt it, that actually constitutes something of singular importance. And that's an old religious idea in some sense, that each person has a soul, let's say, that is somehow a center of reality itself, and that needs to be manifested in life itself, and that if it isn't manifested, then something of tremendous value is not brought forward, and worse, and this is the end of the case, let's say, and worse, to the degree that that's not brought forward, then something hellish moves in to take its place. And people understand this sort of thing a lot more clearly than you might think if you explain it to them as if they might understand. And then it gives them a series of purposeness that straightens out their life. And so my sense is the way that you revivify democracy is by remembering its fundamental insistence that the individual is the cornerstone of the state, and that everything you can possibly do to fortify the individual. Simultaneously, the individual is the eyes of the state, is that where the living individual is the eyes of the dead state, and the living individual revivifies the state. And to the degree that we forget our concentration on the sovereignty of the individual, right, the divine sovereignty of the individual for that matter, then we undermine the foundation on which democracy is based. And then people look for alternatives. They search for meaning elsewhere in extremist movements of one form or another, or they collapse into a kind of nihilism that's completely counterproductive. And so, well, so that's been my experience.
Well, now it is the end of the Vienna meeting, which was a great meeting. We have had excellent discussions, we have learned a lot, and we have thought a lot. And now I hope to see you in Paris next June. It will be a plenary session, and all of us, we shall be there. So please do come to Paris.
So this morning we had a session on the future of mobility, and we actually discussed what does it mean for the auto industry and what does it mean for the cities. If you look at the auto industry, there has never been as much change as there is today. On the technology side, with connectivity, electrification, autonomous driving, on the social domain, with sharing, more urbanization and new ways of working, and also on the regulation side where it's about emission control and standards, and also on regulation for managing congestion in the city. So we actually covered that. We also talked about what does it actually mean for the cities? How will actually the traffic evolve if you have more AVs and individual mobility through AVs? What would be levers to actually work on getting a mitigation on traffic and basically how to deal with heightened traffic from the community? What would be the impact of actually sharing more cars, of basically having smaller or basically bus-based autonomous vehicles? And actually, how would you deal with competency-based pricing? How would you actually work as a city to make the whole modal mix work and in the end get to better transportation for the whole city?
We had a conversation yesterday in the dinner with
川沿いにって言ってますから、はい、こう
on, I would say, the crisis, the causes of the great financial
ああ、びっ
crisis,
くりした。
and whether or not we are in a situation where we could expect new major
これ、マックスは
difficulties,
どう
taking
す
into
る
account what we have done since the crisis that erupted in 2007-2008.
マックスに
I have to say that the questions which were asked by Nigel were very, very stimulating. I could embark on explaining that, in my opinion, it was very much a multi-dimensional cause that we had to cope with. We had certainly the over-indebtedness that had accumulated from year 2000 up to 2007-2008. Approximately 25% of the global GDP as an additional public and private debt outstanding. That was a major cause. Another cause was the new emerging properties of the new global finance system with the impact of technology, new IT technologies and globalization. And amongst the properties, the emerging properties that I could witness myself when I was president of the ECB in 2007, 2008, 2009, 10, 11, was that the contagion was taking place extremely rapidly. In the old times, you would expect that a major shock here would be transmitted to the rest of the world as a matter of months or even quarters. In the new world in which we are, it's a matter of half days. And we could experience that in 2008 dramatically, obviously, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And we have other causes that are also important because, as I said, it's multidimensional. But I stress that the two causes that I mentioned just now, namely these emerging properties and the rapidity of contagion on the one hand, and the debt overburdening the global economy are still there. And particularly as regards the level of the debt outstanding, public and private, as a proportion of global GDP, we continue to have a piling up of debt more or less at the same pace after the crisis as before the crisis. And this is worrying. And it calls for extreme vigilance, obviously, and hard work to complete all what we have done and should do. Again, to prevent the new crisis, and if we have new shocks that are very difficult to predict, to prove resilience in the new environment which we will have to accept because we have a recession in the US and in Europe, or because we have geostrategic events that would be very, very shocking at the global level, or for any other reason. That's what we discussed.
information for you. It's to talk clear with the group as that means to stabilize our neighborship, to stabilize Africa together with others, but Africa is one of the major challenges. And of course, as attractive as possible in the global competition, which always is the better one. Some people wonder why best practices in government haven't spread faster amongst the democracies. When you see, for example, New Zealand has solved the problem of public finance, why doesn't everybody copy it? Why doesn't everybody copy the way that the South Koreans teach their kids mathematics? Why doesn't everybody copy the way the Swiss decentralize their politics? And I think part of the answer is that we don't really spend nearly enough time looking at what is best practice. I live in the United States, though I grew up in the United Kingdom. One hardly ever hears a reference to other countries' systems in the US debate on healthcare, except when somebody is making a completely caricatured analysis of the way, say, Canada does things. So I think part of what we need to do is stress the need to look at best practice so that politicians and voters become more aware that there are solutions to most of the public policy problems. We just haven't tried them in many countries. On the other hand, I think there's one other side to this that one shouldn't forget. Sometimes you'll meet people who will tell you, well, the Scandinavians have worked everything out, and Sweden or Finland or Denmark has come up with the perfect solution to policy problems. That's often an argument people make on the left in the United States. I don't think the solutions that the Swedes came up with in recent decades necessarily would work in a country as large and as diverse as the United States. So let's look at best practice, let's understand which systems deliver the best results, but let's not pretend that one size is going to fit all. Part of the reason for the success of Western civilization, which is where democracy began, was the diversity of systems and the competition between them.
I recently read that information is now the world's most consequential and contested geopolitical resource. I think that's right. Global internet penetration has revolutionized the information domain, and information operations, which aren't new, are dramatically expanding in scale and scope. This is a new challenge for media organizations, which are already facing a business model crisis and declining trust. Meanwhile, AI advances confer strategic advantage to those with access to lots of data. This has implications for privacy, but also for the information advantage that democracies have traditionally enjoyed.
Well, does diplomacy, European diplomacy exist? It's not an easy question, and the answer is yes or no. Yes, in the sense that is Mrs. Mogherini today exists. She can travel, she can deliver some messages for Europe, but I would say certainly not on the most fundamental issues of foreign policy, because the members of the European Union are, many of them, very old nation states. They have their own foreign policy, defense, security, apparatus, and so forth and so on. I cannot imagine French diplomacy just to be second to European diplomacy, and the same with the UK, as long as the UK is
さあ、北村いい君知ってたよ。さあ、ボイコット。そうやっぱりや、もう見たか。
is first to perhaps reduce as much
くりしたさ、こういうことさ。でこ。
As such is not so bad. And also, I think the EU diplomacy can deal with some relatively secondary issues, such as, for instance, I think of the Timor case in Indonesia, that is issues which are not at the forefront of national diplomacies, but which nevertheless can have some importance. So, to conclude, I would say that
やっぱりプリキュア、問題だから。プリキュア問題だ。原因はやっぱり、元凶はまあ、やっぱり、アンジ教のバットはやった。アンジ教やったんだ。本当に。
Like defense has to do with protecting the identity of a political unit. And I think we have not yet reached the stage when we are able to answer this question. What is identity and what is it exactly that we want to protect?
マジか、北まで行く。してる人さ、びっくりしたさ。びっくりした、本当に、こういうこと。前のことはどうしたんね。お写真来たぞ、あの面が。あの面。そんなよこと。あらかじでね、逆に聞いてもさ、痛いみんな。ミキ君、知ってました。そう。この前さ、女の子さん知ってました。聞いてるじゃん。今、聞かさいわ。何よ。いや、でも、みざみ急に東証にさ、びっくりしたな、当時。音を揉めたらしいな、起きたね。お前いいよ、お前いいよさ。お前はさ、ほんの。ありがとう、ほんのよこ。あとはね、言うかな。お前ら黙ってたんか、言ってたわけ。本当に。知ってたじゃん、誠一君。知ってたじゃん。やっぱり、すごい。マジか。島本すみさんも。おい。褒めてらしいよ。やったけど、本当に。ワシントンってさ、会社こういうのさ、おかしい。本当に。だから、ショーはさ、やっぱりね。もう、退けって言ったよさ。でも社長ってそうなもんでさ。
China is already the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest market for a great many important commodities such as vehicles. The question is whether that economic power translates into political power and strategic power. I think most people would agree, probably even Beijing, that America plays the world's dominant power. The question is, will that economic power, strategic power, economically, politically, it's too soon to tell that, however, on that, because there are multiple different variables. Will there be a direct conflict between China and the US, for example, over dominance of the Pacific? Will China perhaps be constrained by other things? Maybe there'll be internal disruption to China's politics if it cannot manage to, for example, maintain disrupt China's political rise. And finally, there's the question of the rest of the world. because between them, China and the US are not the other major powers have say in this. And at the moment, it looks like most of the other major powers in the world, Japan, the European Union, are closer to the United States than to China. So there's a question whether China, even as the world's largest economy, can become the dominant political power without allies.
ジャニーさんさ、まあそうかまずさあせっかくさなんでだもう黙ってたんやさいやださやっぱり誠一君知ってたやっぱおかしい
for the great emerging middle classes in these countries, formerly poor countries. I think what we're likely to see in the 21st century many people who are either liberated from hard labor or from here's too little hard labor to provide jobs. And what will these means do? How will they be employed? And I think that will be a major factor contributing forward. Also, even though the world population is declining, we're still in an era of massive male youth bulges in about 20 or 30 countries. And there's going to be a lot of pressure to provide jobs for people, whether it's in China, Yemen, Ethiopia, or wherever.
The main question of my talk is if robotics and artificial intelligence and the upcoming industrial revolution are a threat or an opportunity for the world and for manufacturing countries and also for developing countries. And the answer is still unknown, but what is sure now is that we have to invest in the main assets that are characterizing the industrial revolution, the digital transformation, competences, infrastructures, data centers, and all the tools that are fundamental and are considered enabling technologies for the future digital transformation. I also presented the differences between the US, Europe, and China, how they are integrating artificial intelligence into different knowledge and competences and scientific results. For example, in the US, they are investing very much in developing artificial intelligence for humanities, while in China, they are investing in developing artificial intelligence for agriculture application, for producing food, for example. So globalization has obtained some results in terms of being socially connected, but in terms of geopolitics, we still see many differences also in how the digital transformation is implemented in the society. Then I spoke about robotics and how the journey of robotics is coming into us, because robotics was developed for manufacturing countries, for industrial production, and robots are in manufacturing plants. But in recent years, what we have seen is the development of service robotics, which is intended to support services and the offer of services in terms of medical robotics, social robotics, educational robotics. And now what is happening is that robotics is coming into our houses by producing some consumer products and also producing changes in the society in terms of supporting autonomous drive or different products that are revolutionizing business and revolutionizing our life.
We do have a very serious problem that people left behind. The global agenda talks
about eradicating poverty, eradicating hunger, having every child in primary and secondary education. We're off track to achieve these things. And that means not just a few people left behind, it means literally hundreds of millions of people missing out. Take education, more than 250,000,000 children at risk in school as we speak. How can those children live in the future? Due to a knowledge economy have denied the most basic access to education. So it is time for the international community to get a grip on the reality of what is happening. If we want a world that's well fed, where people don't live in extreme poverty, where education is a right, not a privilege, we have a lot to do. International development assistance is important, critical for the lowest income countries. For other countries to be prioritising their budget so that their growth is inclusive and sustainable is critical. There are solutions. What's needed is the political will to activate and implement those solutions.
There are more than 70 million people in the world that are forcibly displaced from their homes, either as refugees crossing borders or displaced in their own country because of war, violence, discrimination, persecution, bad governance. Why is that? The world has become a difficult place where to make peace. We have become unable to make peace and to build peace. So that's the first thing that we need to look at if we want to reduce this global refugee crisis. Meanwhile, what is very important to remember is that 85% of those 70 million people are not in the rich world. They are in poor countries or middle-income countries. So the effort, and the new effort, not just humanitarian, but medium, long-term effort, founded on sound development, both for refugees and for host communities, has to focus on those countries. We have now a global compact on refugees. We will have the first ever global refugee forum in December this year in Geneva. These are opportunity to rally coalitions of actors, not just states and the United Nations, but also the private sector, the business community, civil society, academia, to forge new ways to respond to the global refugee crisis and to finally address strategically its root causes.
The question that you're raising, will Syria find a long-lasting peace? Well, the Syrian people deserve a long-lasting peace. Think about it. They've been 8 years now in a horrible conflict which became from local, regional, and frankly international. So the answer is it must be yes. Now, how to do it is where the challenge is coming. And the only way to do it is actually to end the military conflict, because there is no solution. It's not just a word, it's the truth. There will never be just a military solution. And include everyone. New constitution, elections under the UN supervision. That would be a way to include.
だってメーガンさん、デイビッドさん、君が私旦那に来て
Well, I'm delighted to be able tonight to address the members of the trilaterals and their guests. And I think my focus will be tonight on three things. One is, multilateralism has been the bread and butter of many of us, certainly at the IMF, and we believe that it has been critical in order to address many of the potential disorders of the world. Multilateralism is under threat at the moment, and I think that we have to make every effort to rejuvenate it, adapt it, and make sure that it continues to help govern, particularly the economic developments around the world. That's message number one. My second message will have to do with the much more longer-term consequences of short-term policies and mechanisms, and that is
issues
い
that
わゆ
are
る
being
中東情
debated
勢
at the
めちゃくちゃ
moment
増えて
will mean absolutely
報告
nothing
しただけ実際のところない
in
よ
20 years'
わからない
time
です
if
よ
we have not acted now in order to make sure that the planet remains something that is hospitable for our children and
遠
grandchildren.
い地域というの
My third message, which will not
アメリカだっ
surprise
た
any
ら
of those who know me or my friends, will have to do with inequality, and in particular the inequality that women have to suffer and have had to suffer for a long time. And while inequality as such is a major disruption, I believe that by addressing women's situation and the inequality that they face, it will help quite a way in reducing inequalities. So we'll try to do that tonight.
私のあすごいこっちです
We're living through an era of rapid and disruptive change. That's across the board, economy, society, and what we're seeing is that nowhere is that disruption more evident than the trends associated with climate change. We're all familiar with the extreme events, the temperature rises, and the inexorable change that we're seeing to the planet's ecology as a result of climate change. But a major part of that discussion is how does energy transition and decarbonization of our energy system, which accounts for about 2/3 of carbon emissions, how will that impact climate change, and can we enter an energy transition era rapidly enough to mitigate carbon that will take us to a safe future? This is already happening. Renewable energy today is cost competitive on the grid. In a few years, renewable energy has reached 33% of capacity of global power generation. It's the fastest growing segment, and costs are decreasing rapidly. So what we're going to see is a rapid movement towards energy transition that's also going to be disruptive for the business models of today. It's going to imply new geostrategic relationships among countries as countries move away from resource-dependent fossil fuel-based systems into clean energy systems, and the resource is going to become technology, and technology innovation is going to decide the winners and losers in this race.
The low carbon economy should come because to avoid the climate change, serious effort is necessary. Many of the governments are trying the new technologies, new regulations, new rules to move to that direction. But the IEA, International Energy Agency, assessed the current effort is not enough. We need much more efforts to introduce new technologies about renewables or carbon-related technologies, efficiency in a difficult sector, in the industry, and new regulations. So we need really double or triple our efforts to make it happen. One of the areas which IEA focused on is hydrogen. Hydrogen can be used to store the electricity generated by wind or solar, which is very volatile, and storage is a key element. So battery may not necessarily be enough, so hydrogen can be used. And also hydrogen can be used for steel, cement, some of the industries where the decarbonization is very difficult. So that's another area. The third one will be the hydrogen could be the new transformation for the sectors of the oil or gas producing country. If they can remove carbon dioxide from oil or gas or coal, then these hydrocarbon change into the very friendly, climate-friendly resources. So this may prevent the hydrocarbon as a stranded asset. So maybe the hydrogen is one of the key areas. We need lots of infrastructure building, technologies are necessary, but hydrogen may give us a good chance to achieve the sustainable future.
大体エスタルもされる。いいよな。ちょっ あっちのすまんすりまに
The challenge of dealing with disinformation narrative is that it's not enough just to check the facts, because by definition, any disinformation narrative doesn't have good facts. They make their facts up. They're actually lying. This is why it's disinformation. So the challenge with disinformation actors is that the thing they have in common is they're really good storytellers. They tell a story that people want to believe. A lot of the time they will appeal to anger, they'll appeal to fear, they'll appeal to hatred, and they will try and stop people thinking. They'll try and get people so enraged that they switch